The late afternoon sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of the restaurant, bathing the polished floors and neatly set tables in a warm golden hue. The place hummed with an air of exclusivity, its patrons clad in tailored suits and elegant dresses. This was the kind of restaurant where people celebrated promotions, anniversaries, and life's most cherished milestones. When the door opened and an elderly black woman entered, her presence seemed to momentarily halt the flow of time. She wasn't dressed extravagantly, but there was an understated grace about her. Her navy blue coat was finely embroidered at the cuffs, and her small black handbag rested lightly against her side. She moved slowly, her back straight, each step deliberate. Her silver hair framed a face marked with years of wisdom and experience. Yet her demeanor was soft, humble even. The hostess greeted her with a smile, polite, but tinged with something else. It wasn't overt, but it was there, like a faint shadow. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, her tone courteous but distant. "Yes," the woman said, her voice steady but gentle. "Under the name Mrs. Holloway." The hostess scanned her list, then nodded. "Right this way." She led Mrs. Holloway to a small table tucked near the kitchen, a space far removed from the panoramic views that made the restaurant famous. Mrs. Holloway didn't complain. She took her seat gracefully, setting her handbag beside her, and opened the menu. Minutes passed. Waiters bustled around the room, weaving between tables with practiced ease. Mrs. Holloway folded her hands on the table and waited. She watched as plates of steaming food and glasses of sparkling wine were delivered to tables that had arrived after hers. She caught the occasional glance from other diners. Nyanane. Some curious, others confused. Finally, a waiter approached. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and a name tag that read Todd. He carried himself with the confident ease of someone who felt at home in this world. But his smile was thin, perfunctory. "Sorry for the wait," he said, his tone lacking warmth. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back to take your order." Mrs. Holloway smiled faintly. "Take your time," she said, her voice as calm as still water. Todd nodded briskly and left. She watched as he attended to the other tables, his demeanor entirely different. He laughed with patrons, crouched down to chat with children, and made light-hearted jokes that drew easy smiles. Yet each time he passed her table, his steps quickened, his gaze carefully averted. As more time passed, the room's atmosphere began to shift. A young couple seated near the center exchanged uneasy glances. "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" the woman whispered to her partner. He shrugged, glancing at Mrs. Holloway. "I don't know," he murmured. "It's strange." Meanwhile, Mrs. Holloway remained composed. She had faced this kind of treatment before, the quiet, insidious kind that wasn't loud or overt, but stung just the same. It was in the way service came slower, smiles faded quicker, and respect felt conditional. But she had learned long ago how to carry herself with dignity. Her presence alone was her defiance. Unbeknownst to her, someone else in the restaurant had been watching closely. Seated at a table near the bar, a man in his late 30s observed the scene with growing tension. His name was Elijah, and he was the owner of the restaurant. He had been watching since the moment his mother walked in. Elijah's heart burned as he saw how Todd treated her. The subtle dismissiveness, the smirk he shared with another waiter as he passed her table. It was all Elijah could do to keep his composure. This was his mother, the woman who had raised him with unwavering love and unyielding values. She had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and had sacrificed her dreams so he could chase his own. Everything he had built, the restaurant, his success, was because of her. Yet here she was, being treated as if she didn't belong in the very place he had created. His jaw tightened as he considered his next move. He wanted to storm across the room, to confront Todd and demand an apology. But another part of him held back. He needed to see this play out, to see how far Todd would go. Mrs. Holloway raised her hand to signal Todd as he walked by. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I'd like to place my order now, if you have a moment." Todd stopped, his smile gone. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, turning away before she could respond. That was the breaking point. Elijah pushed his chair back and stood. The room seemed to hold its breath as he crossed it. His presence was commanding, his steps deliberate. When he reached Todd, the waiter looked up, startled. "Elijah," Todd said, forcing a smile. "I didn't know you were here." "I've been here," Elijah said, his voice calm but cold. "And I've been watching." Todd faltered. "Watching what?" "Watching you ignore my mother," Elijah said, his tone sharp. "She's been sitting there for over half an hour without so much as a glass of water. Meanwhile, you've been bending over backward for everyone else." Todd's face turned pale. He glanced toward Mrs. Holloway, who sat quietly, her expression unreadable. Your mother?" he stammered. "Yes, my mother," Elijah said, his voice rising slightly. "The woman you decided didn't deserve your respect." The restaurant fell silent. Conversation stopped, forks paused midair. Even the pianist's hands froze over the keys. Every eye was on Elijah and Todd. "There's no excuse for this," Elijah continued, his voice steady but firm. "You've disrespected the one person I would never tolerate being mistreated. Take off your apron and leave." Todd stood frozen, his face a mixture of humiliation and fear. Then, without a word, he untied his apron, placed it on the counter, and walked out. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, leaving a vacuum of silence in his wake. Elijah turned to the manager, who had been hovering nearby. "Dana," he said, his voice softer now. "Take care of my mother's table. Make sure she has everything she needs." Dana nodded and hurried to Mrs. Holloway's side, offering profuse apologies. Elijah approached his mother's table, his stern expression melting into one of concern. He crouched beside her, taking her hand in his. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked quietly. She smiled, her eyes warm despite everything. "I'm fine, Elijah. You handled it well." "I should have stepped in sooner," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "No," she replied, squeezing his hand. "You let him reveal his true self. That's more powerful than anything you could have said." Around them, the restaurant began to stir back to life, though the atmosphere was changed. Patrons whispered to each other, their expressions thoughtful. Some looked at Mrs. Holloway with quiet admiration, others with shame for having stayed silent. Elijah returned to his table, his mind heavy but resolute. He knew this moment would stay with him, not just as a lesson for his staff, but as a reminder to himself of what his restaurant and his life stood for: dignity, respect, and love.